You wouldn't understand corporate culture." Veronica delivered the line with that particular brand of condescension she'd perfected over our 15 years of marriage. Her manicured fingers traced the rim of her wine glass as she spoke, eyes focused somewhere beyond my shoulder rather than meeting my gaze directly. The dismissal hung in the air between us like expensive perfume, cloying and impossible to ignore. I smiled, not the warm, understanding smile of a supportive husband, not the forced grin of someone pretending everything was fine. This was something else entirely. The quiet satisfaction of a man who understood far more than he revealed and planned much further than she suspected. "You're probably right," I said, cutting into my steak with deliberate precision. "All those late-night strategy sessions with Richard Strauss must involve concepts way above my blue-collar comprehension." The fork paused halfway to her mouth, just for a second, but I caught it. After 2 decades in the electrical contracting business, you learn to notice when circuits don't flow the way they should. My name is Thomas Ashford, and I built the largest electrical contracting company in the tri-state area from nothing but determination and a willingness to crawl through spaces other people wouldn't touch. Ashford Electric employs 300 people, maintains contracts with every major construction firm within 200 miles, and generates enough revenue to keep my wife in designer suits and our daughters in private school. But according to Veronica, none of that qualified me to understand the sophisticated dynamics of her corporate world. "Richard is a respected executive," she said, recovering her composure with practiced ease. "The quarterly planning sessions run late because we're managing complex portfolios across multiple markets. The level of strategic thinking required—" "Is probably fascinating," I interrupted gently. "Tell me more about Richard's approach to portfolio management. I'm always interested in learning new strategies." Her corporate speak faltered. Veronica excelled at using professional jargon as a barrier, but she'd never been particularly good at explaining the actual substance behind the terminology. After 6 years climbing the ladder at Hartwell Industries, she could deploy buzzwords with surgical precision, yet somehow never managed to articulate what her department actually produced. "You're being sarcastic," she said. "Not at all. I'm genuinely curious about your work. For instance, what specific markets are you targeting in these quarterly sessions? Are we talking domestic expansion, international ventures, or perhaps something more specialized?" The questions weren't random. Over the past 3 months, I'd done considerable research into Hartwell Industries and their executive structure. Richard Strauss held the title of Senior Vice President of Strategic Development, but his actual responsibilities remained deliberately vague across all company literature. His background included stints at several firms where he'd left under circumstances that human resources departments preferred not to discuss. Professional networks revealed interesting patterns when you knew where to look. Harassment settlements sealed under non-disclosure agreements, promising careers that derailed after brief interactions with Richard's mentorship. A trail of damage that corporate culture had taught companies to bury quietly rather than address directly. "The specifics are confidential," Veronica said. "Client privacy requirements prevent me from discussing details." Of course, professional discretion is important in any business. I'd learned patience from 20 years of troubleshooting electrical systems. Complex problems required methodical approaches. You identified the source of the malfunction, traced the connections, and systematically addressed each component until the system functioned properly again. My marriage had developed a serious malfunction. The late-night calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. The weekend conferences that somehow never appeared on any company calendar. The way she'd started dressing for work like she was attending evening galas rather than quarterly planning sessions. But tonight wasn't about confrontation. Tonight was about precision. "Actually, that reminds me," I said, refilling her wine glass with careful attention. "We should probably finalize the guest list for Sunday's dinner. Your parents confirmed, and my mother is bringing her famous apple pie. I thought we might also invite some of your colleagues from Hartwell. It would be nice to put faces to the names you mention." My colleagues? Richard, for instance. You speak about him so often, I feel like I know him already. It would be interesting to meet the man behind all those strategic insights. The color drained from her face so quickly, I thought she might faint. Her wine glass trembled slightly before she set it down with exaggerated care. Richard is very busy. Executive schedules don't typically accommodate social dinners. I understand completely. High-level strategic work demands significant time commitments. Still, the invitation stands if his schedule permits. I'd already confirmed that Richard Strauss would be attending the annual Hartwell Industries charity auction this Sunday evening, the same event Veronica had claimed she couldn't attend due to a family dinner obligation. The contradiction had been illuminating. Perhaps we should keep dinner limited to family, she said. Whatever you prefer. Though I should mention, your father called earlier. He seemed particularly interested in discussing recent developments at Hartwell, something about board restructuring and executive accountability measures. He sounded quite engaged with the topic. This wasn't entirely accurate. William Hartwell had called to confirm Sunday's dinner arrangements, but his tone had carried the weight of a man with serious matters on his mind. As the founder and former CEO of Hartwell Industries, he maintained significant influence despite his official retirement. More importantly, he possessed the kind of institutional memory that corporate culture couldn't erase or reframe. Board restructuring? Veronica's voice carried a note of genuine concern. He didn't elaborate. You know how he is about business discussions. Prefers to address important matters face-to-face rather than over the phone. William Hartwell had built his company through an era when handshake agreements carried more weight than legal contracts, and personal reputation determined business relationships. He belonged to a generation that viewed certain behaviors as unforgivable breaches of trust, regardless of their legal technicalities. The conversation continued through dessert, but Veronica's responses became increasingly distracted. She checked her phone twice, excused herself to take a call that lasted 15 minutes, and seemed to forget entirely about her earlier lecture on corporate culture complexities. By the time we cleared the dinner dishes, I'd accomplished my primary objective. The seed was planted. Sunday's family dinner would provide the appropriate venue for more detailed discussions. That night, I lay awake listening to Veronica's restless movements beside me. She'd claimed exhaustion, but her breathing patterns indicated sustained alertness. Around 2 a.m, I heard the soft sound of her phone vibrating against the nightstand, followed by whispered conversation from the bathroom. Corporate culture, apparently, required considerable maintenance even during sleeping hours. The next morning brought the usual routine. Veronica left early for another strategic session, reminding me that she'd be working late again. Her kiss goodbye felt like a contractual obligation rather than an expression of affection. I arrived at the Ashford Electric headquarters by 7, as I had every weekday for the past 15 years. The building hummed with purposeful activity: trucks loading equipment, dispatchers coordinating job sites, electricians reviewing blueprints for the day's installations, real work producing tangible results. My office overlooked the main floor, allowing me to observe the controlled chaos that kept our operation running smoothly. 300 employees depended on the decisions made in this room, and their livelihoods demanded more attention than my wife's corporate games. But even the most demanding electrical systems required periodic maintenance. Sandra knocked on my door around 9. My sister had joined the company 5 years earlier after completing her law degree, initially handling contracts and regulatory compliance. Her sharp mind and natural skepticism made her invaluable for navigating the increasingly complex legal landscape that surrounded our industry. We need to discuss the Hartwell Industries situation, she said, closing the door behind her. What situation would that be? The situation where your wife is having an affair with Richard Strauss, and you're planning something that could destroy our business if you handle it incorrectly. Sandra had inherited our mother's gift for cutting directly to the heart of matters that other people preferred to approach obliquely. It was one of her most valuable professional assets, and occasionally one of her most irritating personal characteristics. "That's quite an assumption," I said. "Thomas, I've been watching you operate for 38 years. You get that particular expression when you're solving complex problems that require multiple steps and precise timing. It's the same look you had when you figured out how to underbid Morrison Electric on the hospital contract while still maintaining our profit margins." She settled into the chair across from my desk with the air of someone prepared for a lengthy discussion. "What makes you think Veronica is involved with Strauss?" "Because I ran a background check on him after you mentioned his name 3 times during our last family dinner. Richard Strauss has a documented pattern of inappropriate relationships with subordinates, sealed harassment settlements at 2 previous companies, and a reputation for targeting married women in vulnerable professional positions. That's circumstantial. Combined with your wife's sudden interest in evening work schedules, weekend conferences that don't appear on any public calendar, and her defensive responses to casual questions about her colleagues, the circumstances form a clear pattern." Sandra opened her briefcase and withdrew a manila folder. "I also contacted our private investigator, the same one we used to verify Morrison Electric's financial situation before the hospital bid. His preliminary report makes for interesting reading." I accepted the folder but didn't open it immediately. Some information, once acquired, couldn't be unknown. "What are you planning for Sunday's dinner?" Sandra asked. "A family meal with meaningful conversation." "Thomas, I'm planning to mention Richard Strauss's name in front of William Hartwell and observe his reaction. If William recognizes the name and associates it with the kind of behavior that destroyed his colleague's daughter 20 years ago, he might feel compelled to take appropriate action." "What happened 20 years ago?" "Richard Strauss was employed by Consolidated Industries when William's business partner, James Morrison, discovered that Strauss was involved with his daughter. The affair destroyed her marriage, ruined her relationship with her children, and ultimately contributed to her nervous breakdown. Morrison never recovered from watching his daughter's life disintegrate, and he held William partially responsible for recommending Strauss for the position." Sandra absorbed this information with the focused attention she brought to complex legal problems. "How do you know about Morrison's daughter?" "Because James Morrison founded Morrison Electric, our primary competitor for the past decade. Before he passed away last year, we had several conversations about the electrical contracting business, industry changes, and the importance of personal integrity in professional relationships. He was quite specific about certain individuals who should never be trusted with positions of authority." "And you think William Hartwell will remember this connection?" "William Hartwell has the kind of memory that built successful businesses before corporate culture learned to obscure accountability through legal technicalities. If he recognizes Richard Strauss as the man who destroyed his business partner's family, his response will be swift and decisive." Sandra opened the folder and reviewed several pages of documentation. "According to our investigator, Veronica and Strauss have been meeting regularly for the past 4 months. Hotel receipts, restaurant charges, weekend trips that correspond with her supposed business conferences. The evidence is comprehensive." I assumed as much. "What's your ultimate objective? Public humiliation, divorce proceedings, financial revenge?" "I want them to lose everything that matters to them: professional reputation, social standing, financial security, family relationships. I want them to experience the complete destruction of the life they've been building through lies and betrayal. Without breaking any laws or exposing our business to legal liability?" "Precisely." Sandra closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. "Then Sunday's dinner is an excellent starting point, but you'll need to be prepared for the consequences. Once William Hartwell takes action, the situation will escalate quickly. Veronica will realize that her corporate culture expertise doesn't include strategies for managing this kind of professional crisis." "I'm counting on it." The rest of the week passed with careful preparation. I confirmed Sunday's dinner arrangements, ensured that William and Margaret Hartwell would arrive early enough for private conversation, and arranged for my mother to bring her famous apple pie, along with her equally famous talent for asking pointed questions at precisely the right moments. Veronica's behavior became increasingly erratic as Sunday approached. She made 3 separate attempts to cancel the dinner, citing sudden work emergencies that required her immediate attention. When I gently insisted that family obligations took precedence over corporate demands, her responses carried a note of genuine panic. Friday evening brought another late-night phone conversation from the bathroom, followed by an unusual request that we consider postponing the dinner until the following weekend. "Your parents are looking forward to seeing the girls," I said, "and my mother has been planning her menu for days. It seems unfair to disappoint everyone because of work scheduling conflicts." "You don't understand the pressure I'm under right now. The quarterly reviews are more demanding than usual, and Richard has been pushing everyone to exceed their performance metrics. Richard certainly seems to demand a lot from his team. Perhaps Sunday's dinner will provide an opportunity to discuss work-life balance with your father. He might have some insights about managing executive expectations based on his own experience building Hartwell Industries." The suggestion seemed to increase rather than alleviate her anxiety. Saturday morning, Veronica made one final attempt to avoid the dinner by claiming she felt unwell. When I offered to call Dr. Patterson for a house visit, she quickly recovered enough to spend the afternoon at her salon preparing for the evening. Sunday arrived with perfect autumn weather, the kind of crisp, clear day that made family gatherings feel like Norman Rockwell paintings, assuming Rockwell had painted people with carefully concealed knives behind their backs. William and Margaret Hartwell arrived precisely at 4 o'clock, as they had for every family dinner over the past 15 years. William's punctuality reflected the discipline that had built Hartwell Industries from a small manufacturing concern into a regional powerhouse, while Margaret's warmth provided the social grace that had sustained their marriage through 4 decades of business pressures. I greeted them at the door with genuine affection. Whatever complications existed between Veronica and myself, her parents had always treated me with respect and kindness. William, in particular, had become something of a mentor during the early years of building Ashford Electric, offering advice about managing growth, maintaining quality standards, and navigating the political complexities of large commercial contracts. "Thomas," William said, shaking my hand with his characteristic firm grip. "How are the girls handling their new school year?" "Becca made varsity soccer as a freshman, and Lucy is considering running for student council president. They're both doing well academically, though Lucy seems more interested in debate club than mathematics lately." "Debate club is excellent preparation for business negotiations," Margaret observed. "Some of the most successful executives I've known were accomplished debaters in their youth." We settled in the living room with drinks while waiting for my mother to arrive and for Veronica to finish her preparations upstairs. The conversation flowed easily through familiar topics: local business developments, the girls' activities, mutual acquaintances, and Margaret's volunteer work with the hospital foundation. William seemed relaxed and engaged, but I noticed the subtle signs of a man carrying significant concerns. His responses occasionally lagged by a fraction of a second, as if part of his attention was focused on matters beyond our immediate conversation. When Margaret mentioned the upcoming charity auction, his expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "The auction should be quite successful this year," Margaret said. "The committee has secured some exceptional donations, and advance ticket sales exceeded expectations." "Will you be attending?" I asked William. "Business obligations may prevent it. There are some personnel matters that require immediate attention." The phrasing was carefully neutral, but William's tone carried the weight of a man prepared to make difficult decisions. Personnel matters, in his vocabulary, typically involved situations that couldn't be resolved through conventional management approaches. My mother arrived at 4:30 with her apple pie and her uncanny ability to sense family tension from across a crowded room. Maggie Ashford had raised 3 children while helping to build a successful business, and 40 years of marriage to my father had taught her to recognize when men were planning something they preferred not to discuss openly. "Where's Veronica?" she asked after greeting the Hartwells. "Finishing her preparations upstairs. She should be down shortly." "I see. And how has she been feeling lately? She looked rather tired at Lucy's soccer game last week." "Work has been demanding. Lots of late nights and weekend obligations." My mother's expression suggested she understood considerably more than my words conveyed, but she simply nodded and began arranging her contribution to the evening's meal. Veronica finally appeared at 5 o'clock, looking elegant in a navy dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her makeup was flawless, her hair perfectly styled, and her smile radiated the kind of professional warmth that corporate culture had taught her to deploy in challenging social situations. "William, Margaret, so wonderful to see you," she said, embracing her parents with apparent enthusiasm. "I'm sorry I'm running late. Work has been absolutely chaotic lately." "What's keeping everyone so busy?" Margaret asked. "Oh, you know how it is. Quarterly planning sessions, strategic reviews, performance evaluations. Richard has been pushing the entire executive team to exceed our targets for the fiscal year." The name dropped into conversation exactly as I'd hoped it would. William's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A slight stiffening of his posture, a momentary pause in his breathing, and a sharpening of his attention that suggested the name carried significant meaning. "Richard?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Richard Strauss, my supervisor. He's the Senior Vice President of Strategic Development. Brilliant man, really. His approach to market analysis and portfolio optimization has transformed our entire department's performance metrics." William set down his drink with deliberate precision. "Richard Strauss," he repeated slowly, as if testing the words for accuracy. "Do you know him?" Veronica asked, apparently oblivious to the change in her father's demeanor. "I may have encountered that name in a professional context some years ago." "What's his background?" "Extensive experience in strategic development across multiple industries. He joined Hartwell about 18 months ago after successful tenures at Consolidated Industries and Meridian Corporation. His expertise in complex portfolio management has been invaluable for our expansion initiatives." Each word seemed to deepen William's concern. I watched his face transform through a sequence of recognition, calculation, and cold fury that spanned perhaps 10 seconds, but felt like an eternity. "Consolidated Industries," he said finally. "Yes, I remember now." The room fell silent, except for the soft sounds of my mother arranging dinner preparations in the kitchen. Margaret looked confused by her husband's sudden intensity, while Veronica seemed to realize that she'd somehow stepped into dangerous territory without understanding how or why. "Is there a problem?" Veronica asked. William stood up slowly, his movements carrying the controlled precision of a man who had made a significant decision. "If you'll excuse me for a moment, I need to make a phone call." He walked toward my study with the purposeful stride of someone who had identified a problem that required immediate correction. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow felt like the sound of careers ending and reputations crumbling. "What was that about?" Margaret asked. "I'm not sure," Veronica said, but her voice carried a note of genuine fear. Through the closed door, I could hear the murmur of William's voice, though the specific words remained indistinct. The call lasted approximately 5 minutes, during which the living room maintained an uncomfortable silence, broken only by Margaret's attempts at casual conversation. When William returned, his expression had settled into the kind of professional calm that suggested important matters had been set in motion. "Everything all right, dear?" Margaret asked. "Just some business details that needed attention. Nothing that should interfere with our dinner." But something fundamental had changed. William's demeanor carried the satisfaction of a man who had activated networks and relationships that existed beyond the reach of corporate culture's protective mechanisms. Old favors had been called in, obligations had been activated, and wheels had been set in motion that would transform Richard Strauss's Monday morning in ways that Veronica couldn't possibly anticipate. Dinner proceeded with the kind of forced normalcy that families maintain when everyone understands that significant events are unfolding beneath the surface of polite conversation. My daughters, Becca and Lucy, provided welcome distraction with stories about school activities and weekend plans. Their genuine enthusiasm for teenage concerns helped mask the adult tensions that threatened to overwhelm the evening's social pretenses. "Dad, can I get a ride to soccer practice tomorrow after school?" Becca asked. "Of course. What time does practice end?" 6:30, but Coach Morrison wants to discuss my position assignments for next week's game against Central High. The mention of Morrison's name caused William to glance in my direction with what might have been approval. James Morrison's son had apparently inherited his father's coaching abilities, along with his commitment to developing young people's character through athletic competition. "Coach Morrison is an excellent mentor," William said. "His father was one of the most principled businessmen I ever knew." "You worked together?" Lucy asked. "For many years. James Morrison understood that success in business requires personal integrity above all else. He believed that people who compromise their principles in small matters will inevitably compromise them in larger ones as well." The observation was directed toward the table in general, but I noticed that William's eyes lingered on Veronica as he spoke. She seemed to understand that the comment carried meaning beyond its surface content, though she couldn't possibly grasp the full implications of her father's words. "What happened to Mr. Morrison?" Becca asked. "He passed away last year," I said, "but not before seeing his son establish himself as one of the most respected coaches in the district. Sometimes the most important legacy we leave is the example we set for the next generation." The conversation continued through dessert, but I could see that Veronica's attention was focused on matters beyond our dinner table. She checked her phone twice, excused herself for a brief call, and seemed increasingly distracted as the evening progressed. Around 9 o'clock, the Hartwells prepared to leave. William shook my hand with particular firmness, and his expression suggested that he understood considerably more about the evening's true purpose than he'd revealed during dinner. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Margaret said, embracing Veronica with maternal affection. "I hope work becomes less stressful for you soon." "I'm sure everything will work out," William added, his tone carrying multiple layers of meaning. After they left, Veronica helped clear the dinner dishes with unusual efficiency, as if physical activity might somehow dispel the anxiety that had been building throughout the evening. "Your father seemed upset about something," I observed. "He's been under pressure lately. Board meetings, investor relations, the usual corporate politics." "Anything specific?" "Personnel issues mostly. He's always been particular about the kind of people he wants associated with the company. Sometimes I think his standards are unrealistic for modern business environments." "What kind of standards?" "Traditional values, personal integrity, that sort of thing. He doesn't understand that corporate culture has evolved beyond the handshake agreements and personal relationships that defined his generation." The irony was remarkable. Veronica's dismissal of her father's values perfectly illustrated why she'd failed to recognize the danger of her current situation. Corporate culture had taught her to view personal integrity as an outdated concept rather than a fundamental requirement for sustainable success. "Perhaps traditional values serve important purposes," I suggested. "They create unnecessary complications in complex business relationships. Modern executives need flexibility to navigate situations that don't fit into simple moral categories." "Such as?" "Strategic partnerships that require discretion, confidential negotiations that can't be discussed openly, professional relationships that extend beyond conventional boundaries." She was describing her affair with Richard Strauss in terms that made it sound like a sophisticated business strategy rather than a betrayal of her marriage and family. The rationalization was impressive in its complexity and disturbing in its implications. "I see," I said, "and Richard Strauss exemplifies this modern approach to business relationships." Richard understands the realities of contemporary corporate environments. He's willing to make difficult decisions and pursue opportunities that more traditional executives might avoid. Including opportunities that involve married subordinates? The question hung in the air like an electrical charge seeking ground. Veronica's face went through several expressions before settling on defensive anger. "What exactly are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm asking a direct question about whether Richard Strauss's approach to modern corporate culture includes pursuing romantic relationships with married employees. That's completely inappropriate. The question or the behavior? Both. I don't appreciate your insinuations, and I won't tolerate accusations based on whatever gossip you might have heard. I haven't heard any gossip. I'm simply trying to understand the sophisticated dynamics of corporate culture that you've mentioned so often lately." Veronica stared at me for several seconds, apparently trying to determine how much I actually knew and how much I was guessing. Her corporate training had prepared her for many challenging situations, but it hadn't included strategies for managing husbands who asked uncomfortable questions with persistent politeness. "I think this conversation has gone far enough," she said finally. "Perhaps you're right. It's been a long evening, and tomorrow will probably bring its own challenges." The understatement was intentional. Monday morning would indeed bring challenges that neither Veronica nor Richard Strauss had anticipated when they'd planned their weekend strategy session. That night, I lay awake listening to Veronica's restless movements and whispered phone conversations from the bathroom. Around 3 a.m, I heard her crying softly, the first genuine emotion she'd displayed in months. Corporate culture, apparently, didn't include preparation for the consequences of underestimating men who smiled when they should have argued. Monday morning arrived with the crisp efficiency of autumn in the Midwest. I reached the office early, as usual, but instead of diving immediately into the day's electrical contracting concerns, I found myself watching the clock with unusual attention. Somewhere across town, Richard Strauss was about to discover that corporate culture included lessons he'd never learned. Sandra knocked on my door at 8:15, carrying coffee and the kind of expression that suggested significant developments had occurred overnight. "William Hartwell worked quickly," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "How quickly?" "Richard Strauss received a call at 6:30 this morning requesting his immediate presence at Hartwell Industries headquarters. Security escort, personal effects collection, the complete termination protocol." Efficient. William contacted 3 board members yesterday evening. Apparently, they'd been documenting concerns about Strauss's behavior for several months, but lacked the political support necessary to take action. Your dinner conversation provided the catalyst they needed. Sandra opened her briefcase and withdrew a folder containing what appeared to be official documentation. Our investigator maintained surveillance through the weekend. Strauss and Veronica spent Saturday night at the Riverside Hotel, the same location they've used for their previous encounters. Sunday afternoon, while you were hosting family dinner, they met at his apartment to coordinate their response to what they perceived as increasing scrutiny of their relationship. They're planning a response. They were planning a response. Past tense. Current circumstances have probably altered their strategic thinking considerably. I accepted the folder and reviewed the photographs and documentation it contained. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniably damaging. Hotel receipts, restaurant charges, surveillance images that captured intimate moments between my wife and her supervisor. What's Veronica's likely reaction when she learns about Strauss's termination? Panic, followed by attempts to minimize her involvement and distance herself from the relationship. She'll probably claim that Strauss pursued her inappropriately and that she was attempting to manage a difficult professional situation. And if that approach fails? desperation. She'll realize that her corporate culture expertise doesn't include strategies for managing this kind of crisis. The phone rang at 8:45. Veronica's voice carried a note of barely controlled hysteria. "Thomas, I need to talk to you. Something terrible has happened at work." "What kind of something?" "Richard was terminated this morning. Security escorted him out of the building before most people arrived. No explanation, no advance warning, just immediate termination for undisclosed policy violations." "That sounds serious. Do you know what kind of policy violations?" "Nobody knows anything. Human Resources won't discuss the details, and the executive committee issued a statement about maintaining professional standards without providing any specifics." Her voice cracked slightly on the word specifics, suggesting that she understood more about the situation than she was willing to admit. "I'm sure the company had valid reasons for their decision," I said. "You don't understand. This affects everyone in our department. If Richard violated some policy, we might all be subject to review. My position could be in jeopardy." "Why would Richard's policy violations affect your position?" The question was deliberately naive, but it forced Veronica to confront the logical implications of her concern. If she had no inappropriate relationship with Strauss, his termination shouldn't threaten her job security. We worked closely together on several projects. If there were irregularities in his conduct, the review process might extend to his direct reports and collaborative partners. "What kind of irregularities are you worried about?" "I don't know. That's what makes this so frightening. Without understanding the specific accusations, I can't prepare an appropriate response." The conversation continued for several minutes, but Veronica's explanations became increasingly incoherent as she struggled to rationalize her panic without revealing its true source. Finally, she claimed an urgent need to consult with colleagues and ended the call abruptly. Sandra had listened to my side of the conversation with the focused attention she brought to complex legal problems. "She's terrified," Sandra observed. "Appropriately so. Her corporate culture training didn't include preparation for situations where personal behavior has professional consequences." "What's your next move?" "Patience. Veronica and Strauss will make mistakes as they attempt to manage this crisis. Each mistake will provide additional opportunities to escalate the consequences of their choices." The morning progressed with normal business activities, but I found my attention periodically drawn to speculation about the drama unfolding at Hartwell Industries. William's swift action had eliminated the immediate threat that Strauss posed to other employees, but the broader implications of the situation were just beginning to develop. Around 11 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time the caller was William Hartwell himself. "Thomas, I wanted to thank you for last evening's dinner conversation. It provided important information that required immediate attention. I'm glad our discussion was helpful. The individual we discussed has been removed from his position and will not be returning to Hartwell Industries. The board acted swiftly once we understood the full scope of his inappropriate conduct." "That sounds like the right decision for everyone involved." "Indeed. However, the situation may have broader implications that extend beyond immediate personnel matters. Some employees who worked closely with this individual may find themselves subject to additional scrutiny as we ensure that our professional standards are maintained consistently throughout the organization." The message was clear. Veronica's association with Strauss had placed her position at risk, and William was providing advance warning of developments that would affect his daughter's career. "I understand completely. Professional standards are essential for maintaining organizational integrity." "Precisely. I thought you should be aware of these developments given their potential impact on family matters." After William ended the call, I sat quietly for several minutes considering the implications of his words. The situation was escalating exactly as I'd anticipated, but the pace of developments exceeded my expectations. Within 24 hours of Sunday's dinner, Richard Strauss had lost his position, and Veronica faced the prospect of professional review that could destroy her career. Corporate culture apparently moved very quickly when the right people made the right phone calls. Sandra returned around noon with additional information from her network of professional contacts. "Strauss is finished," she reported, "not just at Hartwell Industries but throughout the regional corporate community. William contacted executives at every major company in the area, sharing information about Strauss's pattern of inappropriate behavior. No one will hire him now." Comprehensive. William Hartwell has 40 years of business relationships and a reputation for absolute integrity. When he tells other executives that someone poses a threat to their organizations, they listen. And Veronica? Under investigation. The review will examine all of her projects, professional relationships, and conduct during her tenure at Hartwell. If the investigation reveals evidence of inappropriate behavior or policy violations, she'll face immediate termination. How long will the investigation take? Probably 2 weeks, long enough to be thorough, short enough to minimize disruption to normal business operations. 2 weeks, 14 days for Veronica to experience the gradual disintegration of everything she'd built through her corporate career, 14 days of uncertainty, scrutiny, and growing realization that her sophisticated understanding of corporate culture hadn't prepared her for situations where personal integrity actually mattered. I spent the afternoon managing normal business operations, but part of my attention remained focused on the developing crisis across town. Around 3 o'clock, Veronica called again. "Thomas, I need to come home early today. The office environment is impossible right now." "What's happening?" "Everyone is gossiping about Richard's termination. People are speculating about the reasons, spreading rumors, creating a hostile work environment. I can't concentrate on my responsibilities with all this distraction. Perhaps the situation will settle down in a few days. You don't understand how corporate environments work. Once rumors start circulating, they take on a life of their own. People begin questioning everything, looking for hidden meanings in normal interactions, creating problems where none existed before." The irony was remarkable. Veronica was describing exactly the kind of scrutiny that her behavior with Strauss deserved, while framing it as an unfair persecution that threatened innocent employees. "I'm sure your colleagues understand that you weren't involved in whatever led to Richard's termination," I said. "That's just it. Nobody knows what led to his termination. Human resources won't discuss the details, which makes everyone suspicious of everyone else. The uncertainty is creating paranoia throughout the entire department." "Have you considered asking your father for information? As the company founder, he might have insights into the board's decision-making process." "I can't ask my father about personnel matters. That would be completely inappropriate and could compromise my professional standing even further." "Even further?" The phrase had slipped out before she could catch it, revealing that she understood her professional standing was already compromised. "I mean, it could create the appearance of nepotism or special treatment. Corporate governance requires clear boundaries between family relationships and business decisions." "Of course. Professional boundaries are important in any organization." The conversation ended with Veronica's promise to be home by 4 o'clock, though she warned that she might need to work late that evening to catch up on projects that had been disrupted by the day's events. Sandra stopped by my office again around 4:30. "Interesting development," she said. "Strauss tried to contact several former colleagues at other companies, apparently looking for employment opportunities. Word has already spread throughout the professional community. Nobody will take his calls. William's network is efficient. More than efficient. Devastating. Strauss's corporate career is over, not just locally, but regionally. His reputation is destroyed beyond recovery." "And Veronica?" "Still under investigation, but the preliminary findings aren't encouraging. The review has uncovered evidence of extended lunch meetings, unexplained travel expenses, and personal use of company resources that coincide with her association with Strauss. Grounds for termination? Potentially. Hartwell Industries maintains strict policies about personal conduct and appropriate use of company assets. If the investigation confirms policy violations, termination would be inevitable. I drove home that evening with a sense of satisfaction that surprised me with its intensity. For months, I'd watched my marriage deteriorate while Veronica pursued her sophisticated corporate relationship with increasing boldness. Her dismissive attitude toward my concerns and her condescending lectures about corporate culture had been particularly galling. Now, corporate culture was teaching her lessons that she'd never learned in business school. Veronica's car was already in the driveway when I arrived home, but the house felt strangely quiet. I found her in the kitchen, staring at her laptop screen with an expression of growing despair. "How was your afternoon?" I asked. "Terrible. The investigation is expanding to include everyone who worked closely with Richard. They're reviewing all of our projects, examining expense reports, questioning colleagues about professional relationships." "That sounds thorough. It's excessive. They're treating everyone like criminals instead of recognizing that we were simply doing our jobs under Richard's supervision." "What kind of questions are they asking?" "Inappropriate questions about personal interactions, social activities, travel arrangements. They're looking for problems that don't exist. Or problems that do exist but were previously overlooked." Veronica looked up from her laptop with an expression of genuine fear. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that thorough investigations sometimes uncover issues that weren't apparent during normal business operations. If the review is as comprehensive as you describe, they'll probably examine every aspect of professional conduct during Richard's tenure." "You sound like you think they'll find something wrong." "I think they'll find whatever actually happened. If everyone maintained appropriate professional boundaries and followed company policies, the investigation will confirm that fact. If some people violated policies or engaged in inappropriate conduct, the investigation will reveal those violations as well." The logic was unassailable, but Veronica's reaction suggested that she understood exactly what kind of violations the investigation might uncover. "I need to prepare for tomorrow's interview with Human Resources," she said finally. "Interview. All of Richard's direct reports are being interviewed as part of the investigation. I need to review my projects and prepare explanations for any questions they might ask about my professional relationship with him." That sounds like a reasonable approach. Honesty is usually the best strategy in these situations. Honesty? Complete transparency about your professional interactions with Richard. If you have nothing to hide, honesty should be straightforward. Veronica stared at me for several seconds, apparently trying to determine whether my suggestion was naive or threatening. "Of course I have nothing to hide," she said finally. "My relationship with Richard was entirely professional." Then the interview should go smoothly. She spent the evening preparing for her interview, reviewing files and practicing responses to potential questions. I helped the girls with homework and managed normal household responsibilities, while listening to Veronica's increasingly agitated phone conversations with colleagues who were facing similar scrutiny. Around 10 o'clock, she received a call that seemed to increase her anxiety considerably. The conversation was brief, but I heard enough to understand that additional evidence had been uncovered that would be addressed during tomorrow's interviews. "Problems?" I asked when she ended the call. "They found some irregularities in expense reports that need clarification." "What kind of irregularities?" "Restaurant charges, hotel expenses, travel costs that don't correspond exactly with official business activities." "That does sound like something that would require clarification." "The charges are all legitimate business expenses. The timing and documentation might appear irregular to people who don't understand the complex nature of strategic development work. I'm sure you'll be able to explain the business justification for all the expenses." "Of course I will. It's just frustrating to have my professional integrity questioned because of documentation technicalities." That night, I lay awake listening to Veronica's restless movements and periodic trips to the bathroom for whispered phone conversations. Her anxiety was palpable, and her attempts to rationalize the investigation's findings were becoming increasingly desperate. Corporate culture was teaching her that personal integrity couldn't be separated from professional success, regardless of how sophisticated her strategic thinking might be. Tomorrow's interview would provide the next lesson in her education. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of gray, overcast sky that seemed to mirror the mood developing throughout our household. Veronica had spent most of the night preparing for her interview with Hartwell Industries' Human Resources Department, and her growing anxiety was impossible to ignore. She left the house at 7:30, dressed in her most conservative business suit and carrying a briefcase filled with documentation that she hoped would explain away the irregularities that the investigation had uncovered. Her goodbye kiss felt like the gesture of someone who wasn't certain she'd be returning home with good news. I arrived at Ashford Electric by 8 o'clock, but my attention was divided between normal business operations and speculation about the drama unfolding across town. Sandra joined me for coffee at 8:15, bringing updates from her network of professional contacts. The investigation has expanded beyond Veronica and Strauss, she reported. 3 other employees are under scrutiny for policy violations related to expense reporting and inappropriate use of company resources. A pattern of misconduct? Apparently. Strauss created an environment where normal professional boundaries were routinely ignored. Expense reports were falsified to cover personal activities, company credit cards were used for unauthorized purposes, and business travel was arranged to accommodate personal relationships rather than legitimate corporate needs. How extensive was the misconduct? Significant enough to warrant a complete review of departmental operations. The board is considering whether to restructure the entire strategic development division. Sandra opened her briefcase and withdrew a folder containing additional documentation. Our investigator obtained copies of the expense reports that will be discussed during today's interviews. The evidence is comprehensive and undeniably damaging. I reviewed the documents with growing amazement at the boldness of Veronica and Strauss's behavior. Restaurant charges for expensive dinners on evenings when Veronica had claimed to be working late. Hotel expenses for weekend conferences that didn't appear on any official calendar. Travel costs for trips that had no apparent business justification. They weren't particularly careful about concealing their activities, I observed. Arrogance. They assumed that their positions provided protection from scrutiny and that corporate culture would prioritize discretion over accountability. A miscalculation. A catastrophic miscalculation. William Hartwell built his company on principles that don't accommodate the kind of behavior they were exhibiting. The morning progressed with normal business activities, but I found myself checking the clock frequently as Veronica's interview time approached. At 10 o'clock, she was scheduled to meet with Human Resources to discuss her professional relationship with Richard Strauss and to provide explanations for the financial irregularities that the investigation had uncovered. Around 11:30, my phone rang. Veronica's voice carried a note of barely controlled panic. Thomas, the interview was a disaster. They have documentation of everything. Restaurant receipts, hotel charges, travel expenses. They know about all of it. What did you tell them? I tried to explain that the expenses were related to legitimate business activities, but they have detailed records that contradict my explanations. They know the restaurants we went to, the hotels we stayed at, the trips we took together. What kind of business activities were you conducting at these restaurants and hotels? Strategic planning sessions, confidential negotiations, market research discussions, the kind of work that requires privacy and discretion. And they didn't accept those explanations? They asked for documentation of the business outcomes from these sessions. Meeting notes, strategic plans, negotiation results, research reports. I couldn't provide anything concrete. The problem was obvious. Veronica and Strauss had been conducting personal activities while claiming business justifications, but they'd never bothered to create the documentation that would support their claims. What happens next? I've been placed on administrative leave pending completion of the investigation. They want to review all of my projects and professional activities during the past 6 months. How long will that take? They said the review would be completed within a week. If they find evidence of policy violations or misconduct, I'll face immediate termination. And if they don't find evidence of violations, then I'll be reinstated with a formal reprimand and additional oversight of my future activities. The conversation continued for several minutes, but Veronica's explanations became increasingly desperate as she struggled to rationalize a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her control. Finally, she claimed an urgent need to consult with an attorney and ended the call abruptly. Sandra had listened to my side of the conversation with the focused attention she brought to complex legal problems. Administrative leave is essentially a precursor to termination, she observed. They're providing time to complete the documentation necessary for a legally defensible dismissal. How strong is their case? Overwhelming. The expense report violations alone would justify termination, and that's before considering the broader pattern of inappropriate conduct. What about Strauss? Completely destroyed. Word has spread throughout the regional business community that he was terminated for cause from Hartwell Industries. His reputation is beyond recovery. I spent the afternoon managing normal business operations, but part of my attention remained focused on the developing crisis that was consuming my wife's career. Around 3 o'clock, Veronica called again. "Thomas, I need to discuss something important with you. Can you come home early?" "What kind of something?" "I'd rather not discuss it over the phone. It's about our family's financial situation and how recent developments might affect our long-term security." The phrasing suggested that she was beginning to understand the broader implications of her situation. Loss of her position at Hartwell Industries would eliminate nearly half of our household income and destroy her prospects for similar employment elsewhere. I arrived home at 4 o'clock to find Veronica pacing in the living room with the restless energy of someone confronting the collapse of carefully constructed plans. Her professional composure had cracked, revealing genuine fear about her future. "We need to discuss our options," she said without preamble. "What options are those?" "Financial planning, legal strategies, damage control measures. If I lose my position at Hartwell, we'll need to adjust our lifestyle and consider alternative income sources." "Such as?" "I could look for positions with other companies, though the current situation makes that challenging. Or I could consider consulting work, freelance projects, perhaps starting my own strategic development firm." The suggestions revealed how completely she'd failed to understand the implications of her situation. No reputable company would hire an executive who'd been terminated for cause from Hartwell Industries, and consulting work required a professional reputation that she'd systematically destroyed. "Have you discussed these options with potential employers or clients?" I asked. "Not yet. I wanted to talk with you first about our financial priorities and family obligations." "That's thoughtful. What kind of positions are you considering?" "Senior management roles with regional corporations, strategic development consulting for mid-sized companies, perhaps business development opportunities with firms that need expertise in market analysis and portfolio optimization." Each suggestion was more unrealistic than the last. Veronica was describing career opportunities that required exactly the kind of professional reputation and personal integrity that she'd compromised through her relationship with Strauss. "Those sound like excellent opportunities for someone with the right qualifications and references," I said. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that senior management positions typically require impeccable professional references, and consulting work depends on reputation and credibility within the business community." "Are you suggesting that I won't be able to find appropriate employment?" "I'm suggesting that your recent experiences at Hartwell Industries might affect how potential employers evaluate your qualifications." Veronica stared at me for several seconds, apparently beginning to understand that her corporate culture expertise wouldn't protect her from the consequences of her choices. "The situation at Hartwell is based on misunderstandings and policy technicalities," she said finally. Once I have an opportunity to explain the circumstances to potential employers, they'll recognize that I was caught in an unfair situation. What circumstances would those be? Richard pursued me inappropriately, creating a hostile work environment that I was trying to manage professionally. The expense report irregularities resulted from his pressure to participate in business activities that I didn't fully understand were inappropriate. The explanation was remarkable in its creativity and disturbing in its dishonesty. Veronica was attempting to reframe her willing participation in an extramarital affair as victimization by an aggressive supervisor. That's an interesting perspective, I said. Do you have documentation that supports your account of Richard's inappropriate behavior? Documentation? Emails, text messages, witness statements, formal complaints to human resources, the kind of evidence that would substantiate your claims about hostile work environment and professional coercion. The relationship was subtle. Richard was careful not to create obvious evidence of his inappropriate conduct. But you participated in expensive dinners, hotel stays, and business trips with him over a period of several months. That seems like extensive participation for someone who was being coerced. I was trying to manage a difficult professional situation while maintaining my career prospects. Sometimes that requires accepting circumstances that aren't ideal, such as having an affair with your married supervisor. The question hung in the air like an electrical charge seeking ground. Veronica's face went through several expressions before settling on defensive anger. I was not having an affair. My relationship with Richard was entirely professional, despite his attempts to make it something more. The hotel receipts suggest otherwise. What hotel receipts? The documentation that Hartwell's investigation uncovered. Receipts for hotel rooms that you and Richard shared during supposed business trips. How do you know about hotel receipts? Because I've been investigating your relationship with Richard Strauss for the past 3 months. I know about the restaurants, the hotels, the weekend trips, and the expense report falsifications. I know everything. Veronica stared at me with an expression of complete shock, as if the possibility that her husband might investigate her suspicious behavior had never occurred to her. You've been spying on me? I've been trying to understand why my wife was spending so much time with her supervisor and why she'd become so defensive about her work schedule. The investigation confirmed what I already suspected. What you suspected? That you were having an affair with Richard Strauss and using company resources to finance your relationship. That's completely false. The evidence suggests otherwise. Hotel receipts, restaurant charges, travel expenses, surveillance photographs. The documentation is comprehensive. I retrieved Sandra's folder from my briefcase and placed it on the coffee table between us. Veronica stared at the folder as if it contained explosives. What is that? Proof of your relationship with Richard Strauss. Everything that Hartwell's investigation discovered, plus additional evidence that my investigator collected. You hired an investigator. I hired a professional to document your activities and provide evidence that could be used in legal proceedings if necessary. Veronica opened the folder with trembling hands and reviewed the photographs and documentation it contained. Her face went through a sequence of emotions: shock, fear, anger, and finally, resignation. This is all circumstantial, she said finally. Hotel receipts are not circumstantial. Surveillance photographs are not circumstantial. Expense reports that falsify business justifications for personal activities are not circumstantial. You don't understand the complexities of corporate relationships. I understand that you've been lying to me for months while conducting an affair with your supervisor and using company resources to finance your betrayal of our marriage. The conversation continued for another hour, but Veronica's attempts to rationalize her behavior became increasingly desperate as she confronted the overwhelming evidence of her misconduct. Finally, she retreated to our bedroom, claiming exhaustion and a need to consider her legal options. That evening, I helped the girls with homework while listening to Veronica's agitated phone conversations with attorneys, former colleagues, and friends who might provide support during her crisis. The conversations revealed that her professional network was already distancing itself from her situation, and that legal representation would be expensive and unlikely to produce favorable outcomes. Around 10 o'clock, she received a call that seemed to devastate whatever remaining optimism she'd maintained. The conversation was brief, but I heard enough to understand that additional evidence had been uncovered that would be presented during the final phase of Hartwell's investigation. "More problems?" I asked when she ended the call. "They found Richard's personal credit card records, charges that match the dates and locations of our business meetings. That sounds like corroborating evidence. It proves that he paid for some of our business activities with personal funds rather than company accounts. Or it proves that your business activities were actually personal activities that he paid for because they weren't legitimate company expenses." Veronica stared at me with growing realization that her situation was beyond salvage through rationalization or legal maneuvering. "What do you want from me?" she asked finally. "I want you to understand that actions have consequences, and that corporate culture doesn't provide immunity from accountability." "And then what?" "Then we'll discuss the terms of our divorce and the custody arrangements for our daughters." The word divorce seemed to complete her understanding of how thoroughly her choices had destroyed the life she'd built. Corporate culture had taught her many sophisticated strategies, but it hadn't prepared her for the moment when personal integrity actually mattered more than professional advancement. Tomorrow would bring the final phase of Hartwell's investigation and the formal termination of her career. But tonight, she was beginning to learn that some mistakes couldn't be corrected through strategic thinking or corporate networking. The education was just beginning. Wednesday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the weather was mocking the cold reality that had settled over our household. Veronica moved through her morning routine with the mechanical precision of someone who understood that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse entirely. She'd spent most of the night on phone calls with attorneys, trying to find legal representation that might somehow salvage her situation at Hartwell Industries. The conversations had been uniformly discouraging. No reputable employment attorney wanted to represent someone whose misconduct was documented as thoroughly as hers had been. "I have to go in for the final interview this morning," she said over coffee, her voice carrying none of its usual corporate confidence. "What time?" 10 o'clock. 10? Human Resources wants to review their findings and give me an opportunity to respond before the board makes their final decision. "What kind of response are you planning?" "I'm going to take full responsibility for the expense report irregularities and request consideration for the difficult position that Richard put me in." The strategy was pathetic in its desperation. Veronica was still trying to portray herself as a victim while acknowledging enough culpability to seem contrite, but the approach satisfied neither requirement for mercy nor accountability. "That sounds like a reasonable approach," I said, though we both understood that no approach would change the outcome at this point. After she left, I called Sandra to discuss the final phase of our own investigation. While Hartwell Industries was documenting Veronica's professional misconduct, we needed to prepare for the legal proceedings that would follow her inevitable termination. "Everything is ready," Sandra reported. "Divorce papers, custody petitions, financial disclosure requirements. We can file as soon as Hartwell makes their announcement." "What about the property settlement?" "Complicated by her employment situation. If she's terminated for cause, she'll lose her severance package and her stock options. That reduces the marital assets subject to division, but it also eliminates her ability to contribute to ongoing household expenses." "And custody?" "Strong case for primary custody based on her demonstrated pattern of deception and poor judgment. The affair, the expense report fraud, and the general instability of her situation all support our position." I spent the morning managing normal business operations, but my attention was focused on the drama unfolding across town. At 10 o'clock, Veronica was sitting in a conference room at Hartwell Industries, listening to a detailed recitation of her professional failures and personal betrayals. The call came at 11:15. Veronica's voice was barely recognizable through her tears. They terminated me. Immediate dismissal for policy violations and misconduct. Security escorted me out of the building. I'm sorry to hear that. No severance, no references, no stock options. They're also considering legal action to recover the fraudulent expense reimbursements. How much money are we talking about? Nearly $15,000 over 6 months. Restaurant bills, hotel charges, travel costs that they're claiming were personal rather than business expenses. Will you be able to repay that amount? With what? I just lost my job, and no one else will hire me after this. My career is over. The conversation continued for several minutes, but Veronica's explanations dissolved into incoherent sobbing as she confronted the complete destruction of her professional life. Finally, she claimed a need to drive somewhere quiet to collect her thoughts and ended the call abruptly. Sandra arrived at my office around noon with additional updates from her network of contacts. It's worse than we anticipated, she reported. Hartwell isn't just terminating her. They're making an example of her. The board issued a company-wide memo about professional conduct and appropriate use of corporate resources, using her case as a cautionary tale. Public humiliation, complete professional destruction. Every executive in the region will know exactly why she was terminated and what kind of conduct led to her dismissal. And Strauss? Completely ruined. Word has spread throughout the business community that he was terminated for cause and that his inappropriate conduct extended to multiple employees. He'll never work in corporate management again. Sandra opened her briefcase and withdrew the legal documents we'd prepared for this moment. Are you ready to proceed with the divorce filing? I reviewed the papers carefully, considering the finality of the step I was about to take. 15 years of marriage, 2 daughters, a shared history that had once included genuine affection and mutual respect. But those considerations paled beside the systematic betrayal that Veronica had chosen to pursue. File the papers this afternoon, I said. Custody arrangement? Primary custody with supervised visitation until she demonstrates stability and appropriate judgment. Property settlement? Fair division of assets, but no ongoing support given her misconduct and the circumstances of her termination. Sandra collected the signed documents and prepared to initiate the legal proceedings that would formalize the end of my marriage. One more thing, I said. I want to ensure that the girls understand what's happening and why these decisions are necessary. Age-appropriate explanations? Honest explanations. They're old enough to understand that their mother made serious mistakes that have consequences for our entire family. That afternoon, I left the office early to be home when Becca and Lucy returned from school. They deserved to hear about the developing situation from me rather than discovering it through gossip or overheard conversations. I found them in the kitchen, working on homework and discussing their plans for the weekend soccer tournament. Their easy conversation and obvious happiness made the approaching discussion even more difficult, but they needed to understand the changes that were coming to our family. Girls, I need to talk with you about some important developments, I said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. Is Mom okay? Lucy asked immediately. She seemed really upset this morning. Your mother is facing some serious problems at work that are going to affect our entire family. What kind of problems? Becca asked. She made some poor decisions about her professional relationships and her use of company resources. As a result, she lost her job today. The girls absorbed this information with the kind of serious attention that teenagers bring to genuinely important matters. Will she be able to find another job? Lucy asked. That's going to be very difficult. The circumstances of her termination will make it hard for other companies to consider hiring her. What does that mean for our family? Becca asked. It means that your mother and I are going to get divorced, and that you'll be living primarily with me while she works on rebuilding her life. The word divorced hung in the kitchen like smoke from an electrical fire. Acrid, unavoidable, and indicative of serious underlying problems. Is it because of her job? Lucy asked. It's because of the choices she made that led to losing her job. Sometimes adults make decisions that have consequences for everyone they care about. The conversation continued for nearly an hour as the girls asked questions about custody arrangements, living situations, and how the divorce would affect their daily lives. Their questions were thoughtful and mature, revealing that they'd already sensed the growing tension between their parents. Will we still be able to see Mom regularly? Becca asked. Yes, but those visits will be supervised until she demonstrates that she's made the changes necessary to be a positive influence in your lives. What kind of changes? Lucy asked. Taking responsibility for her mistakes, making better decisions about relationships and professional conduct, and showing that she understands how her choices affected our family. Around 5 o'clock, Veronica returned home looking like someone who'd spent the day confronting the complete collapse of her carefully constructed life. Her professional composure was gone, replaced by the kind of raw desperation that comes from understanding that sophisticated strategies can't solve fundamental character problems. The girls know about your termination and about the divorce, I said before she could speak. You told them? They deserve to hear it from me rather than discovering it through gossip or legal documents. What did you tell them? The truth. That you made poor decisions that had serious consequences for our entire family. Veronica stared at me for several seconds, apparently trying to determine whether there was any possibility of salvaging the situation through negotiation or emotional appeals. We need to discuss this rationally, she said finally. There might be ways to work through these problems without destroying our family. Such as counseling, mediation, perhaps a trial separation that gives us time to address the underlying issues. What underlying issues are those? Communication problems, different expectations about professional relationships, misunderstandings about appropriate boundaries. Even in the face of complete professional and personal collapse, Veronica was still trying to rationalize her behavior as a series of misunderstandings rather than deliberate choices. The underlying issue is that you had an affair with your supervisor while using company resources to finance your relationship and lying to your family about your activities, I said. That's an oversimplification of a complex situation. It's an accurate description of documented behavior that resulted in your termination and the end of our marriage. The conversation continued through dinner, but Veronica's attempts to negotiate alternative outcomes became increasingly desperate as she confronted the reality that her choices had eliminated most of her options. Around 8 o'clock, she received a call that seemed to complete her understanding of how thoroughly her situation had deteriorated. The conversation was brief, but I heard enough to understand that Richard Strauss had attempted to contact her and that his own situation had become even more desperate than hers. Richard, I asked when she ended the call. He wanted to discuss coordinating our legal strategies, but I told him that any further contact between us would only make things worse. Probably wise. He's talking about leaving the area, starting over somewhere else where his reputation hasn't been destroyed. That might be his best option. He asked if I'd consider going with him. The suggestion was so absurd that I almost laughed. Veronica's affair with Strauss had destroyed both of their careers, ruined her marriage, and damaged her relationship with her children. The idea that they might somehow build a successful future together demonstrated a complete disconnection from reality. What did you tell him? That I need to focus on salvaging what's left of my relationship with my daughters and finding some way to rebuild my life. That sounds like the first reasonable decision you've made in months. That evening, I helped the girls with homework while Veronica made phone calls to family members, informing them about her termination and the impending divorce. The conversations were uniformly difficult, as she struggled to explain her situation without revealing the full extent of her misconduct. Around 10 o'clock, she received a call from her mother that seemed to provide some measure of comfort. Margaret Hartwell had always been supportive of her daughter, but even maternal love had limits when confronted with behavior that violated fundamental principles of integrity and responsibility. "What did your mother say?" I asked after the call ended. "That she's disappointed in my choices, but that she'll always love me." "And your father?" "He won't talk to me. Mom says he's too angry about the damage to the family reputation and the embarrassment I've caused." William Hartwell's response was entirely predictable. A man who'd built his success on personal integrity and professional ethics couldn't easily forgive behavior that violated everything he'd taught his daughter about character and responsibility. "Perhaps time will help," I said, though we both understood that William's forgiveness would require genuine repentance and demonstrated change rather than simply the passage of time. That night, Veronica spent hours packing her belongings and preparing to move out of the house we'd shared for 15 years. The legal separation agreement required her to find alternative housing while the divorce proceedings continued, and her limited financial resources meant that her options were severely constrained. "Where will you go?" I asked as she filled boxes with clothes and personal items. "I found a small apartment across town. It's not much, but it's what I can afford until I figure out how to rebuild my career." "Have you had any promising conversations with potential employers?" "No one will return my calls. Word has spread throughout the business community about the circumstances of my termination." "What about consulting work or freelance projects?" Who would hire a consultant who was terminated for expense report fraud and inappropriate conduct? My professional reputation is destroyed. The conversation continued as she completed her packing, but her responses revealed that she was beginning to understand the long-term implications of her choices. Corporate culture had taught her many sophisticated strategies, but it hadn't prepared her for the consequences of fundamental character failures. By midnight, her belongings were loaded into her car, and she was ready to begin the next phase of her dramatically reduced circumstances. The woman who'd once lectured me about corporate culture complexities was now facing a future that included unemployment, professional ostracism, and estrangement from her family. "I'm sorry," she said as she prepared to leave. "For what specifically?" "For all of it. The affair, the lies, the damage to our family. I made terrible decisions that hurt everyone I care about." "Yes, you did. Is there any possibility of forgiveness? Not now, but eventually?" "That depends on whether you learn from this experience and make the changes necessary to become someone worthy of forgiveness." "What kind of changes?" "Taking complete responsibility for your choices without rationalization or blame shifting. Demonstrating genuine remorse through actions rather than words. Rebuilding your character through consistent ethical behavior over an extended period." "How long would that take?" "Years, maybe decades. The kind of fundamental change required to rebuild trust after this level of betrayal doesn't happen quickly." Veronica nodded slowly, apparently beginning to understand that her sophisticated corporate training hadn't prepared her for the most important lessons about integrity, accountability, and the consequences of character failures. As her car disappeared into the night, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. 15 years of marriage had ended, but the systematic deception and betrayal that had poisoned our relationship was finally over. Corporate culture had taught Veronica many things, but it had failed to teach her the most important lesson of all, that personal integrity couldn't be separated from professional success, and that some mistakes destroyed everything you'd built, regardless of how sophisticated your strategic thinking might be. The education was complete, but the consequences would last for years.